Welcome to episode 132 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by a 17 lost guy. It's March 12, 1900, and today's story is about one of the strangest symmetries in football history. Because on this day in 1900, Woolwich Arsenal beat Loughborough 12-0 in the second division. It remains Arsenal's biggest league win, and what makes it remarkable is not just the size of it, it's the opponent. Because the same club, Loughborough, had already handed Arsenal their biggest league defeat, 8-0, just over 3 years earlier. Same pair of clubs, same division, two scorelines at opposite ends of Arsenal history, and all of it compressed into a little over 3 years, between December 1896 and March 1900, in an era when English football still felt half modern and half improvised. But how did we get here? Arsenal's beginning is one of the great industrial origin stories in football. The club was formed in Woolwich in late 1886 by workers from the Royal Arsenal Armaments Complex. First came Dial Square, then Royal Arsenal, and then, after professionalism and incorporation, Woolwich Arsenal. And in 1893, they did something genuinely radical. They joined the Football League, becoming the first Southern club to do so. And that mattered, because the Football League was still largely a Northern and Midland world, industrial, professional, suspicious of the South, suspicious of amateur pretension, and not yet convinced the London Works team belonged in its structures. But Woolwich Arsenal forced their way in. They entered the second division and became, in a real sense, pioneers for Southern football in the national game. Loughborough came from a different football landscape. The club emerged in 1886 from a merger of the town's leading sides, later formally becoming Loughborough Athletic and Football Club. They built themselves in Midland football, joined the Midland League in 1891, won it in 1894-95, and were then elected into the Football League second division for 1895-96. So while Arsenal arrived at the southern outsider, Loughborough arrived the more familiar way, by proving themselves in a strong regional competition and climbing into league status. Both clubs were now in the same division, but they were not the same kind of institution. Arsenal had the symbolism, the southern novelty, and the backing of a famous industrial base. Loughborough had the local footing of a smaller town club trying to survive in a brutally unstable football economy. Their first meetings suggested Arsenal got the upper hand. On January 4, 1896, Woolwich Arsenal beat Loughborough 5-0 in Plumstead, but the return on February 29 turned that neat picture crooked. Loughborough won 2-1 at home. Then came the next season, 1896-97. Arsenal beat them 2-0 in September. So by the time the clubs met again on December 12, 1896, nothing pointed towards catastrophe. And yet, catastrophe is exactly what arrived. The context was already chaotic, because Arsenal ended up with two competitive matches on the same day. They had to travel to Loughborough for a league fixture and also entertain Leighton in the FA Cup qualifiers. That alone tells you something about football in the 1890s. Organization was still loose enough that a club could be pulled in two directions at once and simply had to cope. Arsenal fielded its second best team, yet still beat Leighton in the cup on the same day. But in the league, at Loughborough, and with the best team, they were destroyed, 8-0. And the local match report is part of why this result has lived so long. It doesn't describe a lucky thrashing or a smash and grab. It describes domination. Loughborough, in the words of that report, beat this powerful combination by 8-0 and could have had more. 2 goals were disallowed, and another struck the woodwork. The report says that 10 would not have flattered them. The weather was vile. The home side adapted, but Arsenal didn't. And by halftime it was already 4-0, and by the end it was an avalanche. And the details matter, because they give the match a shape. Loughborough's forwards were described as irresistible, with pace, movement, and finishing that Arsenal could not live with. Arsenal, for their part, were said to keep trying, but the backs were weak, and the goalkeeper had scarcely any chance with the shots that beat him. This was not a narrow defeat distorted by one moment. It was a collapse. And yet here's where the story gets stranger. Neither club immediately turned into anything stable or grand. They kept bumbling around the second division, which in those years could feel less like a polished national championship and more like a traveling experiment in football survival. The scorelines around them were absurd. January 28, 1899, Barnsley beat Loughborough 9-0. It's still Barnsley's record league win. That very same day, Arsenal were hammered 6-0 by Derby County in the FA Cup. On April 1st, 1899, Loughborough themselves beat 10-0. So this was a football world in which some clubs were building toward the future, and others were barely holding the walls up, and every now and then the scoreboard exposed the gap in brutal terms. And then the story bends again in late 1899. Arsenal appointed Harry Bradshaw in the summer of that year, and he would become the first truly successful long-term manager in the club's history. He brought structure, tactical intelligence, and the beginnings of a stronger side. Loughborough, meanwhile, were unraveling. Results worsened, money was short, the team weakened, shrank, and their fine Football League season was turning into a disaster. On Boxing Day, December 26, 1899, the clubs met in Plumstead. Arsenal were 4-0 up when thick fog forced the referee to abandon the game with about 15 minutes left. That abandoned match is crucial, because if the final whistle had simply been allowed to arrive, Arsenal would have had a comfortable win and Loughborough another heavy defeat. Instead, the match had to be replayed. History was delayed. By March 1900, the atmosphere around Loughborough was bleak. On March 3rd, Arsenal went to Loughborough and won 3-2. The winning goal was disputed furiously by the home crowd, and the aftermath brought disciplinary trouble for the club. A week later, on March 10th, Arsenal beat Newton Heath 2-1. Yes, Newton Heath, which later becomes Manchester United. That same day, Loughborough lost 7-0 at Barnsley, just over a year after losing 9-0 at the same time. So when the replay of the abandoned match finally came around on March 12, Arsenal were clearly the stronger side. They had only beaten Loughborough by 1 goal 9 days earlier, and nothing about that 3-2 suggested what was coming. Then it came, 12-0. The replay of the abandoned Boxing Day game was staged at the Manor Ground in Plumstead. Arsenal scored 4 in the first half, and then 8 in the second. Loughborough were finished long before the end. 6 different Arsenal players scored. Gowdy got a hat-trick. John Dick scored twice. Ernst Cottrell scored twice. James Tennant scored twice. Alexander Main scored twice. And John William Anderson got 1. It was not one man going berserk. It was the whole side taking turns. That is what makes the scoreline so ruthless. This was not one freak individual performance. It was systemic collapse on one side and collective flow on the other. There's another ugly layer. Loughborough were in such financial distress that Arsenal had to help cover their traveling expenses to get them to London. Their team was weakened, patched together with amateurs and reserves, some of whom had barely played. So yes, Arsenal were excellent, but Loughborough were also a club already falling through the floorboards. That is why the result needs to be told in 2 voices at once. For Arsenal, it was revenge. For Loughborough, it was exposure. So what does this change? For Arsenal, not immediately everything, but eventually a lot. They didn't go up in 1900. Promotion came in 1904. They were relegated again in 1913. But after the First World War, when the First Division was expanded in 1919, Arsenal were elected into it, controversially, permanently, and historically. And they have been there ever since. So this strange old Second Division tale belongs to the prehistory of one of football's great permanent powers. For Loughborough, the story goes the other way. The 1899-1900 season is generally remembered as one of the bleakest in Football League history. 1 win, 8 points from 34 matches, 100 goals conceded, bottom of the table, failure to gain re-election. And then, on June 29, 1900, the club was effectively finished, just over 3 months after Arsenal put 12 past them. Loughborough were defunct. That gives this fixture a melancholy weight, because Arsenal's greatest league win is not just a glorious old statistic, it is also one of the last public scenes in the death of another club. And then there's the historic oddity itself. Often is a club's record league win and league defeat against the same opponent. But not often. There are echoes elsewhere. Manchester United's biggest league win came against Wolves, and one of the heaviest league defeats did too. Athletic Bilbao and Barcelona have supplied that kind of symmetry in Spain. Juventus and Inter gave Italian football a famous pair in 1960 and 61. And Chaos Offenbach and Bayern München provided German version. And then in Brazil, Corinthians and Fluminense mirror each other in exactly this strange way. So Arsenal's case is unique because of how early it is, 1896 and 1900, way before the First World War, way before the modern pyramid has settled, and way before Arsenal became Arsenal in the way we understand the name. This symmetry sits right at the dawn of league football, which gives it a different kind of magic. It is not a quirk buried deep in a mature modern history. It is there, almost at the beginning. So before we go, 3 things to take away from March 12, 1900. First, football's record books are not always built by giants. Sometimes they're built by unstable clubs, strange divisions, and moments when the sport is still inventing itself. And second, the same fixture can mean completely different things at different moments. In 1896, Loughborough looked like Arsenal's tormentor. By 1900, club collapsing in public. And third, Arsenal's biggest league win and biggest league defeat being against the same opponent is not just a fun stat. It's a reminder that before Arsenal became a permanent top-flight institution, they lived in the chaos too. On this day in 1900, Woolwich Arsenal beat Loughborough 2-0 in the second division. A scoreline that still stands as Arsenal's biggest league win against the very same club that had handed them their biggest league defeat just over 3 years earlier, making this one of the rarest and strangest symmetries in football history. That's all for episode 132 of OTD, Daily Dose of Soccer History by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, we go to March 13, 1909, England's amateur 11 against Germany, a 9-0 demolition by a national team that no longer exists, and a doorway into the old world of amateur football, Olympic gold, and export of England's game to the rest of Europe. See you tomorrow.